This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. We are 1 week into the federal government shutdown and months into a regional drought. Later in the show, we'll hear from farmers and a forester in our region about how the lack of rain is affecting both crops and the wilderness. But before we do that, let's turn to Washington, where senators on Capitol Hill are in a stalemate right now over health care and the budget. The Senate is expected to take its sixth vote today on stopgap funding bills that would reopen the federal government. But with deliberations at a standstill, it appears unlikely that this will happen. We're joined today by U.S. Senator Peter Welch, a Democrat and Vermont's junior senator. Before he began serving in the Senate in 2023, he was Vermont's representative to Congress for 16 years. He's currently a member of the Senate Finance Committee. Senator, welcome back to Vermont Edition.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're glad to have your time today. And listeners, if you have a question for Senator Welch or want to share how the shutdown affects you or your community, we'll be speaking with him for the first part of this show only. So call in now. Our number is 800-639-2211, or you can email vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. So, Senator, Democrats are saying that this standoff on Capitol Hill right now all comes down to one key issue, health care. You and other Democrats have decided to shut down the federal government over Republicans' decisions to cut federal funding for health insurance. It's a big swing. Can you make the case for us? What exactly is at stake for Vermonters?
Well, first of all, I really disagree with your characterization that we are promoting a shutdown. Mm-hmm. The fact is that when a bill comes over that passed by one vote from the House and it comes to the Senate, traditionally there's negotiation about the terms of an agreement. And what's happened here is that President Trump has done something that no president has done before. He has ordered my Republican colleagues to not talk to the Democrats. So there is an impossibility, if you can't have the two parties sit down to discuss a policy difference, to resolve the policy difference. And in fact, in my discussions with my Republican colleagues, many of them share the concern I have about the loss of the Affordable Care tax credits that make health insurance within reach for Vermonters and for Americans. So this is a problem that is going to affect folks, their bookkeepers, their single moms who are working but paying for the health care through the Obamacare system. It's small businesses. It's going to affect folks in Vermont, as I've been hearing from Vermonters, but it's also going to affect folks in Texas and Iowa and Alabama. The other thing that's so significant about this is that November 1 is a drop-dead date about whether folks who are getting help to pay for their insurance will lose the premium tax credits to assist in that. November 1 is that date. So the continuing resolution that we have goes through November 21st. So basically what would happen if we don't resolve this is that about 5 million Americans and about 45,000 Vermonters would be in desperate jeopardy about hanging on to the health care that their family depends on.
So there's no other way that this could be addressed, the expiration of federal tax credits for health insurance, in a way that's separate from the spending bill?
It's not so. It could be done separately, but it would have to be done by November 1st. Mm-hmm. And obviously it makes sense to have it be part of the spending bill. That's traditionally the place where, when you have a policy dispute, you would resolve it and then have it move along through the legislative process. But the big deal here is that November 1 is a time-certain critical date. So to say we'll do it separately or we'll do it later basically capitulates and says that folks will be in jeopardy of losing their health care.
So there was a press release that was sent by your office yesterday that had a line in it that echoes some of what you're saying right now. It said government funding lapsed on Tuesday, and Senate Republicans have so far refused to work with Democrats to protect health care and reopen the government. I know you're saying President Trump has basically ordered Republicans on Capitol Hill not to negotiate with Democrats. On the other side, are Democrats trying to work with Republicans? Are there concessions on the table from your end?
There's absolutely efforts on my part, I'll speak for myself, to work with Republicans. You know, I sent a text and spoke on the floor to the chair of the Finance Committee from Idaho, Senator Crapo, and also to Senator Wyden, our ranking member. And I said, look, why don't you two designate a couple of Republicans and a couple of Democrats to sit down and get concrete and specific. Just this morning in the Judiciary Committee, I spoke to Senator Hawley, who shares my concern about what happens to people in Missouri if these premium tax credits expire. So there's a lot of interest among individual Republican senators. But what Senator Crapo basically indicated was that until they got the heads up from President Trump, they wouldn't be in a position to have these discussions. You know, and frankly, that's very disappointing because we as senators have independent responsibility to act to try to help the folks we represent. And whether it was President Biden, if he told us not to negotiate, I would disregard that if it meant that meant I couldn't help Vermonters. So my view here is that we should together solve a problem that actually affects folks in red states and blue states. This healthcare is brutal for folks. If they lose their healthcare, I mean, yesterday I was in Vermont with some Vermonters, you know, a woman who has a food service business. She's got 2 kids and a husband. Her healthcare premiums will increase by like 300%. And she said something that was very poignant to me. She said, you know, I'm a mother. It would be totally irresponsible for me not to have insurance in case my kids get sick. But she says, with my income, it may be totally impossible for me to have health care. And you know what? It's on the United States Senate to not put her in that position. We should be helping those.
We're speaking with Senator Peter Welch. I believe we might have just lost him. We're going to work on getting him back right now. We're currently discussing the federal government shutdown, which has entered its second week today. As you might have heard, the Senate is expected to take its 6th vote today on stopgap funding bills that would reopen the government. But deliberations are at a standstill right now, as they often are on Capitol Hill, and it's appearing unlikely right now that the government is going to reopen very soon. We're working to reconnect with Senator Peter Welch, Vermont's Democratic senator, junior senator, and we're trying to get him on the phone. We lost our connection with him, so please stand by. It's the beauty of live radio. We might have him with us. Senator Welch, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
All right. Well, I always love filling some dead air, so that made it exciting. I'm awake now. Let's dive back in. I apologize we got cut off there. Yesterday, President Trump said he was going to fire federal workers en masse if this shutdown continues. There are about 6,000 federal employees in Vermont who might be worried right now. Does that change your calculus at all?
It's illegal. I mean, the president does threaten to do things that are illegal. But we had a very careful briefing before we went into this. And the question was, does a president have more authority to fire people in a shutdown versus when government's open? And the answer to that very clearly was no. Now, that does not mean that Trump won't act in that illegal way, because he does do that. But there's no legal authority for him to fire people just because we're in a shutdown status. There can be furloughs. And of course, we do have a statute, because that's really inconvenient for folks, paycheck to paycheck. If your paychecks stop showing up, that's really, really hard. And I get that. But the statute does guarantee that if there's a delay in you getting paid, you're going to get paid when the shutdown ends.
And thank you to Jennifer and Winooski for sending us a question via email about that. Senator, I want to ask you about something that the governor of Vermont, Phil Scott, said on Vermont Edition yesterday. He sent a letter at the end of September to congressional leaders and urged Congress to rise above partisanship and pass a long-term budget agreement. And if they couldn't do that, Governor Scott thought Democrats should at least vote with Republicans to pass a funding extension. Let's take a listen to this clip in which he's responding to some of the criticism that he received for that letter.
I'm not surprised that the Democratic Party itself came out with something like this, to try and further divide Vermonters and so forth. We as states red and blue, have to come together at some point to pass bills and again, with Republicans and Democrats coming together to pass a bill that we can all live with.
So the governor's claiming that the Democratic Party is leaning into partisanship and further dividing Vermonters. How do you respond to that?
Well, there's an aspect of what the governor's talking about that I identify with. Americans are really, really dismayed that we've gotten into a situation where things like a shutdown and things like refusing to pay our debt become tactics. And there's been 6 shutdowns in the past 30 years. And it's an indication that the political system is not working. But, it goes back to what I was saying about the healthcare and the urgency of acting, because Vermont is going to be hammered. Vermonters are going to be hammered if we don't have this resolved by November 1st. I was mentioning that family where it was the woman who has her own food service business, and she's got 2 kids. And I don't know if that answer was cut off or not.
We did hear most of it, yes.
Yeah, and we just can't allow that to happen. And what I find really sad is that the issue is so important to people, whether you're in a red state or a blue state. The healthcare burdens on our families are enormous. And by the way, what's so terrible about losing this healthcare is it's not just about those individual families in Vermont and all around the country. That means our hospitals are going to be under incredible financial duress, and they already are. So we've got a lot of good community hospitals in Vermont. They can lose millions of dollars because all these folks who don't have health care, it doesn't guarantee they won't get sick, and they'll show up, they'll get uncompensated care. Their budgets get really eviscerated. And then there's a cost shift so that our good employers in Vermont who are trying to provide coverage for their workers are going to see themselves getting hammered with higher premiums. So, I really hate shutdowns, but I really am appalled at the idea that because Congress won't act, Vermonters and Americans are going to lose access to the health care that they depend on.
Yeah. Well, one more inside politics question on this for you, Senator. The Democratic base has been calling on Democrats in the House and Senate for months now to stand up to the Trump administration. There was a lot of criticism going on around this back in March when Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer helped pass a Republican Senate bill to avoid a shutdown. And now he's taking a very different approach. He is kind of leading the charge around this shutdown to stand up to Republicans and try to keep funding health insurance as you've described. But I am curious, why? What do you see as the reasons for this shift in tactic from now compared to March?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, we have seen the president acting in a way that no other president has acted. He's personally demanding his political enemies be prosecuted. He is completely disregarding bipartisan budgets that have been passed with Republican and Democratic support. He's unilaterally destroying agencies like the USAID agency that he had no authority to do, that would pass funding that was presented by Congress. So there's a real sense from Vermonters and a lot of Americans that there's a lawlessness in this presidency that we haven't seen elsewhere. And there's a real apprehension that the democratic values and the norms are being violated on a regular basis. And that puts, that understandably really concerns citizens. And they're looking to us to stand up and resist that. And it's a very difficult situation, quite frankly, because if we're in the minority, the president is acting with all the authority of the president, but also abusing that authority. The tariffs are a good example to an incredible harm and disruption to our businesses in Vermont. We don't have the votes right now. He's got the House, he's got the Senate, and he's got the presidency. We have 47 votes versus 53 in the Senate. And a lot of folks are really frustrated that we can't do more, but I can assure them, are doing every single thing we can. And obviously, it's going to take all of us to be standing up to try to reaffirm the norms of democracy that are so important in Vermont in our tradition of town meetings, where You have active discussions about policy disagreements right there in town. You can argue vehemently, but at the end of the day, you help your neighbor out of the ditch, and you are respectful of people you disagree with.
Well, Senator, I know the federal government shutdown is the big news of the moment in Washington right now. But I would also like us to acknowledge that today is October 7th, the 2-year anniversary of the attacks by Hamas in Israel. And they're still got hostages in Gaza, both dead and alive. The war has claimed more than 67,000 Palestinian lives. The UN Human Rights Council has deemed that a genocide. Do you hold any hope about the current peace talks that are underway?
Well, first of all, I just do want to acknowledge how absolutely catastrophic October 7th was for the people of Israel. It was unbelievably appalling, and they lost so many lives as a percentage of their population, and the gruesome nature of the violence by the terrorist organization Hamas. And then that has to be acknowledged by every single one of us.
Yeah.
Second, I actually do have a little bit of hope, because I am seeing that there is a plan which would stop the bombing, stop the killing, and hopefully start flooding in the medicine and food that the people of Gaza desperately need. So I have a glimmer of hope and support the efforts that President Trump is making with the Arab states to have a ceasefire, to have a return of a surge of aid, and hopefully start the long process of a two-state solution.
And Senator, lastly, we're going to be speaking in a moment with Vermont farmers about the historic drought that's happening right now all across our state. Is there anything that Congress can do right now, particularly amidst a federal government shutdown, that would support farmers and other folks in Vermont who are being so deeply affected by the lack of rainfall?
Well, there may be. Now, first of all, the drought is brutal. I've been talking to our farmers, and one of our farmers up in the Northeast Kingdom, who's been doing this for 56 years, said there's never been a drought as bad as this one. Now, number two, you're seeing right now that the president wants to put billions of dollars in aid to the Midwest farmers who've lost their markets because of our tariffs. So that's a pretty crazy thing. The farmers want to sell their product, but because they lost their market as a result of the tariffs that the president has imposed, he wants to pay them directly. Well, you know what? If we're going to come up with that kind of aid, why don't we include our farmers that, through no fault of their own, but as a result of the weather, need some relief? So I'm going to do whatever I can to help out in this situation that has put our farmers in Vermont in a crisis situation.
Well, we'll be talking more about that subject in just a moment on Vermont Edition. But first, let's let Senator Peter Welch get back to work. Senator, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Up next, most of Vermont, as you just heard, is in a severe to extreme drought. We'd love to hear how the lack of rain has affected you, your farm, your family. You can call in at 800-639-2211 or email vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. And we'll hear straight from some Vermont farmers in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Nearly all of Vermont is in the midst of a severe to extreme drought. Dirt looks like dust, the tree leaves are crackly and brown, and sections of Lake Champlain have turned into sandbars. This drought is particularly difficult for the folks in our region who work with plants and animals, like farmers and foresters. For the rest of this hour, we'll share stories of how the drought is impacting our landscape. Joining us is Margaret Loftus, the co-owner of Cross Molina Farm in West Corinth. They grow vegetables and pasture livestock there. Margaret, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time out of your day. Also, for some perspective on our wild lands, we have Oliver Pearson on the line. He's the Director of Forestry for the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks, and Rec. Oliver, welcome back to the show.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And listeners, we'd love to hear what you have observed from the land around you this season that feels different from years past. Or maybe this time reminds you of a drought in this region from earlier in your life. You can give us a call at 800-639-2211 or email Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. Oliver, we last talked to you on Vermont Edition in April. How have conditions changed since then?
Well, after a relatively wet spring, we got one last round of significant rainfall on July 10th, which was, that same day that we've had significant rain for the last 3 years. But this year, fortunately, the rainfall on July 10th was nowhere near as bad as in 24 and 23. And then we entered into this dry period where for the rest of July, almost all of August and September, we received very little precipitation, across the state. I think some experts estimate that our rainfall deficit right now is between 8 and 11 inches. And so we're seeing sort of drought of kind of historic proportions. And so what that's meant, is the summer is obviously the growing season for our forests. The trees are engaged in photosynthesis, trying to grow and add sugar, and this drought has created stress and challenging growth conditions and additional vulnerabilities for our trees. And I think we can talk more, but that's visible to the public in a number of different ways. And sort of the three things that I'm most focused on right now is, what is the impacts of the drought on wildland fire risk? The public is very interested in what's going on with the fall foliage right now. And so we're responding to lots of questions about how is the drought impacting fall foliage.
I'm sure.
And then finally, what are the long-term impacts, medium to long-term impacts of the drought on our overall forest health for the forest across Vermont?
Well, I'd like to hear a little bit more about each of those. But first, Margaret, I know you have a diversified farm, so you have both crops and livestock there. What's it been like on your farm these days, and what's taking a bigger hit?
Well, we're fortunate enough to have 2 drilled wells on our farm, and we've been able to irrigate a lot, but not all of our vegetables. So some of them are doing okay. It's not quite the same as rain, so we have seen a reduced yield. Particularly, we're expecting a reduced yield in our potato crop this year. But the biggest impact for us has been we have pastured sheep and pastured cattle. And we depend on the grass to grow to feed them. And this year we saw a lack of grow back from the first pass of the animals on the pastures, and we have actually been feeding hay outside, which we would normally only do in the winter time, since about the end of August, beginning of September.
Oh, wow.
And so that's going to have an impact on us later in the winter. We won't be able to sell as much hay or any hay this year, which is something that we rely on for additional income. And we'll also see a lack. We're worried about going forward into the winter in terms of the health of the pastures next season.
Yeah. Yeah. I also heard that you had some, this just really stuck out to me. You had some lettuce that never experienced rainfall because it grows on a 28-day cycle, and it just didn't rain in those 28 days.
We transplanted lettuce, so the first 2 weeks of its cycle, the 3 weeks is inside, and we're watering it in the greenhouse, and then we transplant it. And then the amount of time between seeding it and our first harvest of that lettuce, it never rained. And so it was grown completely with irrigation, which that is something that has definitely never happened on our farm.
And Oliver, how do trees show signs of stress? There are certain trees in our forests that are a little hardier, can handle these types of drought conditions better than others, right?
Yeah, we certainly have some drought resistant and drought sensitive species out there. Oak, for example, are thought to be more drought resistant, and maples are thought to be a bit more drought resistant. But trees can show the impact of droughts in a couple of different ways. I think visible to the naked eye is the drought conditions, the lack of moisture for roots to absorb from the soil out of the ground can really slow down photosynthesis. And a couple of things can happen. You can sort of have stress on the leaves as a result of that, and they begin to discolor and sort of conclude or wrap up photosynthesis earlier, become discolored, and some leaves even drop their leaves, earlier than normal. So that's a very visible effect that I think folks are seeing across the landscape in Vermont right now. Sort of less visible is drought can also make trees more vulnerable to different types of stresses, diseases that are sort of already present in a normal year, but then can get exacerbated or get worse in a drought year. So for example, maple can be subject to sort of a fungal infection called anthracnose, and we did have a wet spring, which creates the conditions for onset of anthracnose. And when the drought sets in, sort of paradoxically, the tree becomes a bit stressed, and that anthracnose, which sort of became established in the spring, can sort of accelerate and affect the trees more than it would in a regular year, leading to, again, sort of discoloration and earlier leaf loss. So those are just a couple examples of how visibly the drought is affecting trees on the landscape.
So it's kind of perfect conditions for this fungus, unfortunately, the very wet and then the very dry.
Indeed, yeah. And well, the maples are particularly red, and sugar maples are the source of some of our most vibrant fall colors, which are still out there in some places, but where there's sort of ledgy or shallower soils, and more the trees are more dependent on precipitation and surface water flowing across the landscape. Those maples in those conditions are really going to be struggling.
Right. You can call in and tell us what you are seeing out your window as we talk about the drought our region is experiencing. 800-639-2211 is our number. Let's go to Kim in South Burlington. Kim, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to reach out to the farmers in the listening area and just say that this farmer's daughter is thinking of you guys. I don't know what the crops are going to yield as far as like nutritional values. The corn looks like hell. I'm just worried about our farmers because we need you guys. So good luck.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you to that well-timed crackle in the line, too. What does it feel like, Margaret, to hear that? And what kinds of support do you need right now as a farmer in our region?
Well, what the caller mentioned brought to mind two things.
Yeah.
She mentioned corn, and we don't raise dairy cows, and I just want to give a shout out to dairy farmers, which are probably experiencing the effects of the drought more even than we are, because they also not only rely on hay, which there wasn't as much of this year, they also rely on corn, which suffered greatly this year in terms of yield and quality, to feed their cows. And cows also drink a tremendous amount of water. So I know that farmers in the Northeast Kingdom, so far not in our town, but further north of here, are having to haul water in order to water their cows, because they don't have enough water. And I can't even imagine how stressful that must be. And with increased volatility in the weather, 2 years ago we had a similar loss of our potato yield due to the extreme wet conditions. This seems to be kind of the new normal.
Yeah.
And in order to support a vibrant agricultural economy in Vermont, I feel like there needs to be flexible help for farmers when you're facing a situation that's some kind of climate related or weather related disaster. And a drought is a disaster. It just seems to happen in slow motion, unlike a flood. That I've been talking to the folks at NOFA about the Farm Security Fund. That's a bill that's it passed the Senate this past year, and it's going to be back at it trying to pass into law.
Mm-hmm.
It's S60, and it would provide flexible quick, real-time support to farms who need help dealing with weather-related disasters.
Well, Margaret, I want to go back to your first point about the effects of the drought on dairy farmers. That really helps us introduce our next guest, Jesse Wilbur, who is a dairy farmer. Jesse, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Jesse, you own a lazy dog farm in Orwell. As Margaret was just saying, dairy farmers are being hit particularly hard by this drought. What's the impact been on your business there?
Yes, we have been. As Margaret was saying, with the loss of crops and pasturing, we have seen a dramatic decrease in all of our yields. And again, we don't grow corn either. We're a pasture-based herd, but just with that we have not been able to pasture most of the summer. So as she said, she started feeding in end of August, early September. We have been slightly drier in our area, just below Middlebury here, and we actually started feeding early July. So on top of not being able to pasture all summer, that means we had to supplement in the feed that we weren't able to grow this summer either. So it's kind of like a double hit on most of the farmers who pasture. And then again, on the farmers who don't pasture but grow corn, they got the extra hard hit on their corn crops. So it's kind of hard on all of us in all avenues.
Yeah. So how is the drought increasing your production costs?
It has, I don't know, quite as much production cost increase as much as production cost loss. The cows aren't making as much milk. They're stressed. So they're just warm. They're hot. They're uncomfortable most of the time. So they're distressed and don't make as much milk. And again, just having to supplement in the feed, it's just affecting the long-term cost of what your winter feed rations would be or winter supply will be.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we were just asking Margaret was what kind of support would be most helpful to you at this time, either from the community or the state. How do you answer that, Jesse?
I would say just along the lines of what she said. The Farm Security Funds hopefully is a great bill that will get passed that could help provide some resources to farmers that need to buy feed. And I guess just the support of just what the caller earlier said, just saying that we're doing a great job and that they recognize how hard it can be, and noticing that it is all there. Because I think a lot of people, as the regular community, you see the leaves turning, as the forester also said here, and the things drying up earlier, but you just don't realize the effect that without the grass growing, there's no grass to cut. Which is just your year-round cycle. It's not just now; it's all winter. It's next spring, as Margaret again was saying that next year's crops are affected by this year's weather. So we're already looking at potential of next year being a very harmful season again also.
Yeah. Jesse, lastly, before we let you go, this might be a silly question or not, I'm not sure, but I know that dairy farmers often feel so close to their cows. And I wonder if you feel like the cows on your farm can feel the stress of the lack of rain, or if there's any way in which you change the ways that you work with your animals during a period like this.
I don't think that's a silly question at all. I do think the animals feel the stress, as we are a small dairy. We're a tie-stall dairy, so it means I bring the cows in and out every day and hook them to milk them. So I'm personally with them, a lot of the time. So they do feel my stress also, I feel, and that I can see and feel their stress very easily in the situation in which we house them and take care of them. But I just think that the lack of rain, just like I said, has been very hard on them. Is just dry. They're just like us. They're dry. They're irritable. They need a bath. They love the rain. They love the cooler days. Just that they want to be out grazing, but there's no grass to graze. Even now, in the fall, as the weather's been slightly nicer, there's just no rebound of the pastures that we've been 2-3 months without being through. And on a normal pasture cycle, we would be 20 to 30 days before we'd get to run to them. So it's just there's nothing for them to eat or enjoy being outside doing.
Mm. Well, Jesse, we're wishing you the best. Jesse Wilbur is the owner of Lazy Dog Farm in Orwell. It's an organic dairy farm. Jesse, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Have a good afternoon.
You too. All right, we're going to pause here for a short break, but when we come back, we'll hear a bit more about how droughts are affecting both farms and forests and what you can do to help keep our forests safe from forest fires as they are experiencing this lack of rain. That's in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just joining us this hour, we are discussing the drought that's been plaguing our region this summer and fall. The U.S. Drought Monitor analyzes drought conditions, and it shows that as of the start of this month, the vast majority of Vermont is experiencing severe drought, and nearly a quarter of the state is in extreme drought. Our guests are Margaret Loftus, the co-owner of Cross Molina Farm in West Corinth, and Oliver Pearson, the director of forestry at the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks, and Rec. Oliver, let's talk forest fires here for a minute. I mean, this past weekend, there was a fire on Brownell Mountain in Williston. Multiple crews had to fight it. Can you tell us a little bit more about that fire, how it was contained, and other fire risks around the state?
Sure. Yeah, the Brownell fire in Williston was likely caused by human causes as opposed to natural causes like lightning. Fortunately, we were informed, as was local resources, the town of Williston, neighboring towns, very very early on, and we were able to get crews there very quickly to take a look. And one of our state wildfire experts decided that, because there's both, cellular infrastructure as well as residences, in relatively close proximity to that fire, and it was spreading quickly on a slightly windy, hot, dry day with a steep slope where fire could just run uphill. We decided to call in a helicopter that was stationed in New Hampshire to help us combat that fire. So that helicopter came over very quickly, was able to make water scoops in Lake Iroquois and dump water on that fire. And so that sort of knocked it back. It didn't completely extinguish it, but it contained and knocked the fire back. And the crews worked all that afternoon and the next day, and sort of we're very confident, by the sort of the end of the second day that the fire was contained, and we continue to monitor it. But it seems right now that particular fire has been extinguished. So statewide, we've been at sort of high and very high fire risks really since sometime in mid-July. And so those are levels 3 and 4 out of a 5-level scale, with extreme fire risk being the highest risk we have. And we're inching up. We're inching closer to sort of those higher risk indicators. I think if we stay in drought conditions, and when the deciduous trees, lose their leaves, and there's all that combustible leaf litter that's dry on the ground, we'll probably at that point, again, if we stay in drought conditions, get into our sort of extreme fire risk. So what we've done is we've, and actually just before I get into that, there's been over 70 wildfires in Vermont this year, but they've been small. Those 75 fires have burned only around 60 acres together. So we've had lots of small fires, and that's probably because of a wet spring, the leaves still being on the trees, which slows down the spread of fire. There isn't as much combustible material on the forest floor, and good response. The local and state authorities have been very actively engaged, throughout the summer, trying to get out quickly what we observe as starting. So I think what we've done is we've issued a burn ban. What that means is town fire wardens cannot issue permits to burn debris or permits to kindle fires. So that's in place right now. We're keeping a very close eye statewide and having regular briefings with all the municipal fire departments about how to deploy our resources and what our sort of response approach will be if different types of wildland fires come up. And we're considering a campfire ban that would have to issue via proclamation from the governor. New Hampshire has a similar approach, and they actually just issued a campfire ban. We do have some precipitation coming in this evening. There's a storm sort of tracking across the Adirondacks, and we're hoping to get an inch, maybe half inch to an inch of rain tonight. And so we want to see what impact that has, if any. But if that doesn't really change things, which an inch isn't going to make a big difference, we'll work with the administration to see if we can issue that ban on campfires in the not too distant future as well. So it's definitely a very high risk period for us, and we have about within the State Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, we have over 20 staff who are essentially certified to combat wildland fires, and we have 3 or 4 staff who can lead crews, and so all those resources are sort of on standby, ready to be deployed if the need arises.
And if you go on to vermontpublic.org right now, you'll see a story from my colleague Nina Keck, who was on a hike this weekend and found a campfire in Chittenden that hadn't been fully extinguished, and watched as firefighting forces from the U.S. Forest Service and local crews responded to that. So you mentioned...
So if I can come in there very quickly.
Sure.
Yeah, for people who are are making campfires or planning to go camping, weather's still pretty nice out there. Please, fully extinguish any fires you do light, and by fully extinguish, douse them with water. Keep your eye on them at all time, and wait till the ashes have fully calmed down, and even spread those cool ashes out, and just to avoid leaving any ashes that might still be combustible if the wind picks up behind. So that's a real common sense and easy thing that the public can do to help us reduce the risk of starting wildfires inadvertently.
Yeah, thank you for those tips. Now, you mentioned that there's some rain coming in this evening. Margaret Loftus with Cross Molina Farm. What's it like to see rain come down on your farm when there hasn't been rain for a really long time? Does the ground soak it up, absorb it?
It will in the vegetable beds where we've already been irrigating, but for instance, on like the farm roads that are so dry and so dusty, and in like any of the bare spots on the grasses on the farm, in the pastures, the water, it will like the soil becomes sort of hydrophobic, and it will like pool up, and not it can run into a deeper spot in the pasture and pool there instead of spreading around, because the top layer is so dry. And even last week, or yes, I think it was last week, that we got over an inch of rain here. If you dug down and put your hand down into the dirt, the water didn't go beyond the first half an inch. It was dry as a bone beneath that. It's going to take a really good long soaking rain, and lots of them, in order to change particularly the grass areas.
And we're getting to the end of the season. So looking to the start of winter, what concerns do you have? What stands out to you the most right now, Margaret?
Well, I'm worried. I'm also worried about my neighbors,
Yeah.
who don't have drilled wells, who have dug wells. We're in Orange County, and we're one of the drier spots in the state right now, and a lot of people are out of water at our farm store. People come in and out, and you don't say like how are you anymore. You say, how's your water? Do you have water? And so we're beginning to see folks, their wells running dry. And if the ground freezes, it's my understanding that it's harder, even if we start to see a lot of snow and a lot of freeze and thaw, that once the deep ground is frozen, it's going to be harder for the groundwater to recover, and for folks to get those wells back. And looking at a whole winter of having a dry well is pretty tough.
Yeah, yeah. And Oliver, on your end, as we look towards the winter, you said that one of the things you've been thinking a lot about is long-term forest health and the long-term impacts of this drought. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're keeping an eye on in that respect?
Sure. Yeah, I think some of the earlier speakers have spoken about the impacts of the drought, both on farming this year as well as next season. And
Yeah.
forests are in a similar situation where the hydrologic cycle doesn't alter very quickly, and so drought now could spread into stress on the trees once in the winter they go dormant, and once they come out of dormancy in the spring and start ramping up to grow and use photosynthesis to keep them fed and add weight and volume, that they won't have access to the water that they need to do that. So sort of taking a step back, droughts can impact northern hardwood forest, which is the type of forest that we have in Vermont, by reducing growth, as I said, increasing mortality, and leading to greater susceptibility to pests and diseases. And we have numerous different pests and diseases that affect our trees. Beech is dealing with both beech bark disease and beech leaf disease, and beech is one of the most common tree species in the northern hardwood forest. Our ash are, of course, dealing with emerald ash borer, and there's other challenges out there. So this drought will exacerbate those challenges, and that can lead to increased mortality, reduced growth and vitality for some of our trees, and just different types of physiological damage that it's hard for the trees to recover from. And that's all beyond the negative impacts of wildfire should that happen. So I think we'll be monitoring. Our forest health team does a great job monitoring forest health statewide. They do that on the ground and from the air, performing aerial surveys, and we'll continue to get both site specific and landscape scale data on the health of our forests, and just sort of look at what's happening with individual tree mortality, with regeneration, and see where we go. I think as the trees become dormant, they kind of shut off for the winter. And so, if the drought persists into the winter, it won't immediately have a negative impact on the trees as they enter that dormancy period, but it could negatively impact forests come the growing season in the spring. As I said, the other thing that we're just concerned about is these trees. Many trees are food sources for wildlife. There's a term called mast trees, which is sort of mast as a term for food, and mast trees sort of provide food for different animal species. And some of the drought typically reduces mast production, leading to fewer acorns and beech nuts due to the stress that the drought conditions cause. Trees can either abort immature fruit or fail to pollinate properly, and the fruit doesn't develop. And so that may stress wildlife as well. If they're dependent on beech nuts and the beech trees aren't producing as much, that could then lead to decreases in wildlife populations. So we'll be working with our colleagues at Fish and Wildlife to see if there's a connection there, and particularly if this drought persists and affects the growing season next year, we could see those types of impacts. So there's a lot of challenges out there. It'd be great to hope that we'll get a wet winter and a very wet spring, and snowmelt will lead to infiltration of water into our forest soils and sort of correct this trend. But
Yeah.
that's really out of our hands. But we'll be watching carefully to see what winter and spring weather patterns lead to for our forest health.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed on that. Margaret, throughout this conversation, I just keep thinking about the 2 years of flooding that Vermont farmers had to endure, followed by this summer and fall of drought. Vermont farmers are always extremely adaptable in the face of challenges. But I do wonder if these last couple of years have changed the way, like more broadly, that you run your business and farm, be it like what things are growing or how you're diversifying the business or more.
We have been really grateful these past 3 years that we are so highly diversified.
Yeah.
Not only do we do a lot, we raise a lot of different kinds of animals, and we also raise vegetables. We raise a lot of different kinds of vegetables. We're not just growing one kind. And there's always something that does better when it's drier, and something that does better when it's wetter. And so there's that. There's also just really making a more concentrated effort than ever to be very kind and good stewards of the land that we grow on. Treating the soil right, making sure that we're keeping the soil covered at all times by growing cover crops and tarping, making sure that we don't overstress a pasture by moving our animals regularly. We do intensive grazing, so they're not overgrazing an area ever, and they're constantly on the move. And that those practices are a lot of work, but the past 3 years have shown us that it's worth it. In a dry year, you can you have more organic matter, and that helps keep things wetter. In a wet year, you're not washing away all the nutrients in your soil because you have covered soil, and the soil is covered with healthy plants, and the soil is healthy. So it's in a way it's validating for the way that we were already farming, and it absolutely more needed than ever.
Well, Margaret, we're wishing you and your business the best right now. Margaret Loftus
Thank
is the
you.
co-owner of Cross Molina Farm in West Corinth. Margaret, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And Oliver Pearson, the Director of Forestry at the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation. It's great to have you on again.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
All right, that's all the time that we have got for today. As always, you can weigh in on our show. Tell us your own stories from your part of this region by emailing Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. And you can also find Vermont Public on Instagram. Today's show was directed by Aaliyah Papes. John Aarons is our managing producer, and Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro are our producers. Our call screener today was Kelly Delorier, and our theme music's by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch up again soon.